Hello everyone. In this video, we will be covering the differences in the terminology of parameters and arguments in our JavaScript functions. These two words often get confused in our technical communication, and by taking time to really understand what they mean, we can communicate better to others about our code and get less mixed up when we're reading documentation about other people's code. Let's get into it. So I have a small program here that we'll walk through, and then we'll expand on what's happening in this program with a few examples, which will better explain what a parameter is versus an argument. So on line 1 of this program, we are declaring a variable count, and we are initializing it to the value of 0. On line 3, we are declaring a function called add1. Then we're going to skip directly to line 7 because none of this code matters until this function actually gets called. So on line 7, we are reinitializing the variable count to the returned value of the add1 function. So the add1 function will run, and we are passing count into the add1 function, and it's going to take the count here, which becomes num. It adds 1 to it, and it will return that value to our count variable. We will then print out that count variable to the console. So let's run this code quickly. So say node index.js, and our count starts at 0, so we can expect it to be 1. Perfect. Now let's take a deeper dive into what's actually going on here. So when we think about our variables, we want to think about them in two separate steps. We have the declaration and the initialization. So what is count? Count is actually a label that just points to the value of 0. So if we wanted to demonstrate this in my little drawing board here, we can see we have var count equals 0. So what is going on is our count, if we write out, our count here, let me just get my pencil tool. So if we write out our count here, this count is actually a label. And a label, we can think of it as a human readable way to get to our value. In this case, our value is 0. So what happens within our code is when we call a function, we are passing in the variable count. But once we actually step inside of our function, that label gets changed to num. But the value stays the same. It's still 0, but the label gets changed to num. The label being updated is what we would call our parameter. So we would say add1 has a parameter called num. So we think of the parameter as the label of our variable. However, num still retains the same value that count has. So in this case, num will be equal to 0. Now that actual value of 0 is our argument. So to illustrate this, we can think of num as our parameter. So num is our parameter. And the parameter is essentially equal to the label when declaring a variable. And then the actual value that that variable contains, which in our case, in our program, is 0, this is the argument. So whenever we're thinking of our variables, we want to think of them in two ways. We want to think of the name or the label of our variable, and then we want to think of the actual value. So when we're declaring variables, we have the label, and then we have the value. But then within functions, that terminology becomes the parameter and the argument. So if we go back to our code, we can see here that count, once it's passed in, it becomes num. So we'd say the label num is the parameter. But then the actual value of count, which stays the same and is 0, that becomes our argument. So if we were speaking in technical terms, we would say we have a function which has one parameter of num. And then when we'd say we're calling our function add1 with the argument of 0. So that would be the value. Thanks for watching the video. Let me know if you have any questions down in the comments, and have a great day.